Hi everyone, today we have several fourth-year medical students here to share their favorite study resources for psychiatry, the study schedule that they used on their clinical clerkships, as well as general tips so you can do well on your third-year rotations. What study resources do you recommend for this rotation?
For psychiatry, I would do the UWorld psychiatry questions, and I would do the 2 NBME practice tests that are available online. Those are fantastic. That was all you really needed to do the psych test. I think most people in my track got above 90th percentile on that test. It was one of the easier tests. It's really straightforward. Yeah, it was one of the easier tests, I think.
Psych is, I think, the only rotation where I really loved their first aid little subject book for psych. I thought that was super helpful. So the DSM-5 is good for some of the more common things that pop up on the shelf, just to really know those categories very, very well, because that's what that shelf is. It's just reading a list of things and seeing whether or not it meets the description for a certain pathology. And then, like always, UWorld.
Obviously, case files in UWorld were pretty good. One of the books that everyone recommends that I liked a lot was First Aid for Psychiatry. It's not too long, and it's pretty, gives you like a good overview of everything you need to know. The main sections I liked out of there were the psych farms, since most of the questions you can see on the shelf are related to the different drugs you can use to treat different diseases and all the side effects they can cause. So just reading through that book and especially paying attention to the pharmacology section of it.
I did UWorld practice questions and AMBOSS practice questions for psych, and those were both really good. You can use actually a lot of your step 1 resources again for it too. Like I think I used first aid to look up any of the diseases because they're all similar. There's technically like a first aid for psych that I heard people speak well or speak highly of, but I never looked at it or saw it. Pretty much is all the same stuff. I mean, like as long as you can access like diagnostic criteria for any of the diseases, you're fine.
There's UWorld, which you got to do. Those are really good questions. They're good because they present cases that can kind of seem like they get close to blending the lines between certain conditions, so it really helps you key in on what specific things separate one condition from another and making those diagnoses. Another one, after you do your UWorld, definitely listen to online med-ed. I'm just a huge fan. Not everybody does, but I really like listening to those lectures in the car. And then Emma Holliday has a 2-hour summary for psych, and I think she does a really good job going over everything you need to know, plus a lot of kind of weird questions that they might throw at you. So I think she's a really great resource.
I'd recommend doing all the UWorld questions as well as reading Step 1 First Aid. That was such a helpful book. It was kind of a last-minute decision for me to read that book, but I'm really glad I did. There's a lot of random questions that you wouldn't think would be on a psych test on the shelf. So a lot about sexual erectile dysfunction and things like that, which are all listed in First Aid for Psych.
How did you schedule your studying for this rotation?
Studying for psych is pretty difficult because you either are an inpatient or outpatient. If you're inpatient, you round on your patients and then you go by noon sometimes. If you're outpatients, you might be there from 9 to 5. So if you're inpatient, you have plenty of time during your day to study. It's really not a challenge to schedule studying. If you're outpatient, unfortunately, you have to be a little more rigid and break up your questions and be really careful about your time.
Psych, I had great hours. It was like 8 to 3. And so I would just there's not even that many questions on UWorld for psych. And so I would, throughout the day, if I had a patient with a certain thing, I was all inpatient for psych. Highly recommend if you have any control over that. I would read up on whatever they had. So if they had schizophrenia, I would read up on schizophrenia and how it was different than schizoaffective, or, like depression with psychotic symptoms, things like that, because that's the kind of stuff that they really nitpick on for the shelf. And then when I got home, I would just do a half block of UWorld because I think there's only like 150 psych questions on UWorld.
Same thing with the other ones, just making sure that you're studying every single day, even if it's for less than 30 minutes, or some days you'll be able to do more, but just making sure you keep reading. And then for psych, I got tripped up with a lot of the diseases since they're so similarly named, and some of them have dates criteria like 2 weeks versus 6 months for different diseases. I found it helpful to do some Anki for that. I usually don't use Anki, but for psych I had to use some type of flashcard just to get that root memorization down.
If you're in the outpatient setting, patients often will not let you in to see them. So you have a lot of downtime during the day where they don't want to talk to you about their problems, and then you just kind of have to hide off in the corner somewhere. So I had usually at least an hour or two every day where I was off by myself doing practice questions. Again, I brought like my iPad, but doing it on your phone so that you don't have to like lug around a computer made it easier. Also, because psych appointments are scheduled for such a long period of time, if one finished early, that meant we had a ton of downtime in between. And so I was able to like keep sitting in my preceptor's office and studying in the corner. I felt like it looked better that I was on my iPad as opposed to my phone because it didn't look like I was just like messing around on the internet. Maybe that's my own imagination, but every time I had my iPad out, he was like, oh, are you working on practice questions? Whereas every time I had my phone out, he was like, oh, okay. He wasn't. He was also on his phone most of the time. But that was helpful. And then, yeah, as soon as I got home, I was a lot less exhausted after psych than most of the other things. But my brain was a little tired because you spend most of the time sitting and listening. In terms of inpatient, I don't know. I wasn't on inpatient. But I think it's the same thing where, like, you get to leave a little bit earlier potentially and get to go study then.
Psych was nicer for me. I mean, I usually would get out at like 2:33, so I had much more time in the afternoon, so I didn't really have to worry about like trying to cram studying in while I was actually on the rotation. I could focus on really just getting better at interviewing these types of patients. It's a very difficult, different style of interview from any other rotation when you're interviewing a psych patient. So getting better at that, and then when I got home, try to remember, what kinds of stuff did I see today, whether it was like PTSD or whether it was borderline personality, something like that. Go home, do some more reading on it, and then because a lot of psych conditions are really dramatic and they're pretty vivid, it's pretty easy to sort of tie a condition with one patient that you remember. And I think that's a good way to do it.
I found studying for psych to not be that difficult. It was really interesting stuff, and I was able to get in my questions during my short psych rotation pretty easily. I had weekends, so I studied over the weekends. I also studied after my rotations. Psych is one of those rotations where you get done pretty early, so I had a lot of time in the evening to study.
What general tips would you recommend to do well on this rotation?
So I did an inpatient psych rotation, so I think my advice is only good for people who did inpatient psych or who are going to do inpatient psych. I would say know the antipsychotics cold, know their side effects really well, know the process by which a patient can appeal their medications and appeal their holds, know the different kinds of holds, know what a Reese hearing is, and watch your back. Yeah, I would be careful in the psych rotation. A lot of my roommates had difficulties in their inpatient psych rotation because you have to be careful and you have to watch out for yourself more than any other rotation.
So psych is another one where I think your empathy will really help you. And I think it also really depends if you're inpatient or outpatient. I didn't do any outpatient psych, so I can only speak to inpatient. But you're going to see people who are either at the lowest time in their life, people who are there on 5150s for suicide attempts, things like that. Or you're going to see people who are actively psychotic, people who are, hearing and seeing things you can't hear or see. And I think just approaching them with humanity is really important, and not treating it like it's a spectacle. And again, like anything else, just being as helpful as you can be. On my psych rotation, I was seeing like 7 to 8, sometimes 9 or 10 patients on my own, writing notes for all of them. And so as much as you're comfortable taking, I think your preceptors will always appreciate you lightening their load as long as you're doing a good job and not, making it more work for them in the end. And then staying safe is really important, especially if you're on an inpatient psych ward, because these people aren't always acting rationally, and so just making sure you don't have anything dangly that they can grab onto, making sure that you are always, it's the door, you and the patient, in case you need to get away out of a dangerous situation, and then having a chaperone if you really don't feel comfortable interviewing a patient alone. Don't be afraid to ask for one.
The main thing is going to be learning how to talk to patients that might be going through the most difficult time in their lives. I know I saw a lot of things I wouldn't have saw otherwise, and it was kind of eye-opening.
To do well in psych, you have to know the timelines of all the diseases, so like 6 months versus 2 weeks versus 1 month for all of those, and then know your drugs inside and out. Like you have to know every drug, what class they're in, and you have to know like the side effects and why those matter and the indications for all of them. So like what drugs can you use if someone has bulimia versus if they don't, versus if they're trying to lose weight versus if they're trying to gain weight. All of those are going to be tested on. So by far among all of the blocks, it's the most important that you know all of the drugs. A lot of times you can kind of like loosely forget the mechanism of action and all the stuff you learned for step 1, except for in psych, all of that is still really, really, really important.
I would say be as gentle as you can when you're interviewing psych patients. You don't want to say the wrong thing and then they blow up because they blow up over little things all the time. And then that affects your rapport with that patient and with other patients on the ward that saw that incident, and then your attending might see that and it might negatively impact your grade. So always try to be as delicate as you can, as gentle as you can with your questions. Try to be as thorough as you can, but also, be smart, use your judgment about where the line is, and try to get as much as you can without going over the line.
I would recommend knowing your guidelines and knowing the durations really well. That's really where they get nitpicky and it actually matters so much. So knowing when the duration of a specific disease criteria is 6 months versus 3 months versus 1 month or 2 weeks. All of this stuff is really important. I'd also recommend, just for your own edification, maybe asking your preceptor about things like CBT and psychotherapy, cognitive-based therapy, as well as psychotherapy, just because it's something that you don't really get the opportunity to see after your psych rotation. It's not really high yield for the test, but it might be something, if you're interested in, to actually see and hear about from an expert.